The door swung open before Maggie Ramsey could raise her hand to knock. That was the thing that stopped her breath entirely, that froze her right foot mid-step on the worn wooden threshold of the Redemption Creek Community Church on a scorching Thursday morning in the summer of 1884. She had been standing there for what felt like an eternity, her gloved hand half raised, her heart hammering so loudly against her ribs she was certain the whole quiet street behind her could hear it. She had been debating. She had been arguing with herself in the merciless Texas heat, the dust of the main road still clinging to the hem of her dark traveling skirt, the paper in her reticule folded into a small, tight square, as though compressing it might somehow compress the secret it contained. She had been unsure. That was the only honest word for what had kept her standing outside that church like a woman caught between two worlds, one foot in the life she had left behind in San Antonio, and one foot reaching toward something she did not yet understand. And then the door opened. Sheriff Simon Merritt stood in the doorway with the light of the church's interior falling across his broad shoulders, and the expression on his face was not surprise. That was what made everything inside Maggie go utterly still. His dark eyes found hers immediately, as though he had already known exactly where to look. His jaw was set with the particular quiet tension of a man who has been waiting for something difficult and has made peace with the waiting. He was holding his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, and that single gesture of restrained nervousness was somehow more devastating than anything else in that entire long morning. He had been waiting for her. The knowledge of it hit Maggie like a physical thing. It moved through her chest with a force she had not been prepared for, and it made the paper in her reticule feel suddenly heavier than stone. Because if Simon Merritt had been waiting for her at the church, then he already knew. He already knew about the letter. He already knew about the betrayal. He already knew about everything she had been carrying on the 100-mile journey from San Antonio, and he had come here first, ahead of her, and opened a door instead of closing one. The question burning through her entire body in that suspended moment was simple and catastrophic. Did she step through it? To understand why that question nearly broke her, you have to go back 3 weeks. You have to go back to a kitchen table in San Antonio and a letter that was never meant to be read. Maggie Ramsey had not been born into hardship, but hardship had found her with remarkable efficiency. She had grown up the youngest daughter of a respectable dry goods merchant in San Antonio, the kind of family that was not wealthy but was comfortable. And she had learned early that comfort was a gift that could be revoked without notice. Her father, Owen Ramsey, had been a good man in the ways that mattered most, and when he died of a fever in the spring of 1880, Maggie had been 22 years old and suddenly responsible for her mother, for the shop, and for the careful maintenance of a life that had abruptly lost its central support. For 4 years she had managed. She had kept the books with the precision her father had taught her, had managed the supplier relationships, had dealt with the particular brand of patronizing skepticism that men in the merchant trade reserved for women who dared to conduct business without a husband present. She had done all of it with a steady hand and a face that betrayed nothing. What she had not managed well, it turned out, was her own heart. His name had been Douglas Hale, and he had come into her life with the ease and confidence of a man who understood exactly what he was doing. He was 32 to her 26 when they met in the autumn of 1883, the business partner of a local land developer, well-dressed and articulate and possessed of a particular focused attention that made Maggie feel, for the first time since her father died, genuinely seen. He had courted her properly, or what appeared to be properly. He had called on her at the house, had sent flowers, had attended church with her mother. He had told Maggie she was brilliant and that her skill with the business accounts was remarkable. What he had actually been doing was mapping the books. She discovered it on a Tuesday morning in June of 1884, when a letter arrived at the shop addressed to Douglas from a man named Crenshaw in Austin. Douglas was not there, had not been there for 3 days following an argument Maggie had not yet fully understood the significance of, and Maggie opened the letter by mistake, genuinely, assuming it was a supplier correspondence delivered to the wrong address. It took her 4 readings to fully comprehend what she was looking at. Douglas Hale had been working with Crenshaw to execute a forced sale of the Ramsey dry goods property. He had been systematically funneling the store's receivables through a secondary account Maggie had not known existed, reducing the visible value of the business while accumulating debt in its name. The plan, laid out in Crenshaw's letter with bureaucratic plainness, was to present the store as insolvent to the county assessor and purchase it through a proxy at a fraction of its true worth. Douglas had apparently indicated in a previous letter that obtaining Maggie's trust had been easier than anticipated, and that she was unlikely to notice the discrepancy until the transfer was complete. Obtaining Maggie's trust. She had read that phrase 7 times. She had sat at the counter of her father's shop for a long time after that. The letter was in her hands and the shop was quiet around her, and the particular quality of that silence was unlike anything she had experienced before, because it was the silence of a world that had just rearranged itself without her permission. It was the silence of betrayal, which is different from any other silence because inside it you can hear yourself replaying every moment, examining every conversation for the hidden motive you should have seen, retracing the architecture of a deception that was built directly out of your own willingness to trust. She had made herself stop that particular line of thinking within the hour because it was not useful. What was useful was action. She had gone to the county records office that afternoon and learned that the transfer had already been filed, though not yet approved. She had then gone to the attorney she knew from her father's estate, a man named Harold Birch, who had looked at the letter and the account records she had assembled with impressive speed, and told her that what she was looking at was fraud, that it was prosecutable, but that the process would take months and the outcome was not certain. He had also told her something else, something that had sent her directly to the stage office the following morning. The property deed to the Ramsey store and the building it occupied had been quietly transferred 6 months ago as collateral on a loan Douglas had taken in Owen Ramsey's name using a forged signature. The loan had been issued by a man named Harold Crenshaw, who operated out of Austin, and whose legal standing in the matter was backed by a territorial judge who was, according to Harold Birch in a voice carefully drained of all inflection, not known for ruling against Crenshaw's interests. The only legal remedy that had any realistic chance of success, Harold Birch had told her quietly, was to find the original property survey and deed amendment that Owen Ramsey had registered in 1871, which contained a covenant clause that would make the collateral transfer legally invalid. Owen Ramsey had told Harold Birch about this document years ago, had told him it was registered with the county recorder in a small town called Redemption Creek, where Owen had conducted business before moving the family to San Antonio. Harold Birch did not know why Owen had registered it there rather than in San Antonio. He had simply said that if Maggie could get that document to him before the transfer approval, he could file an injunction that would buy them enough time to expose the fraud. Redemption Creek was 100 miles west of San Antonio, a town Maggie barely remembered from very early childhood. She had taken the stage the next morning. She had arrived in Redemption Creek on a Wednesday evening after a long and rattling journey across the hill country, and the town had presented itself to her in the amber light of a late summer sunset with the particular quality of somewhere that existed slightly outside of time. It was not a large town. There was a main street with a hotel, a general store, a saloon, a livery, a barber shop, and a small, squat courthouse with peeling white paint. There was a church at the far end of the street, its white clapboard walls luminous in the evening light. There was a sheriff's office with a lamp burning in the window. The stage had deposited her at the hotel, and Maggie had checked in with the minimum of conversation and gone directly to her room to organize what she needed to do. In the morning, she would go to the county recorder's office and retrieve her father's document. She would be back in San Antonio by the end of the week. That had been the plan. The county recorder's office had opened at 8 the following morning, and Maggie had been standing at the door when it did. The recorder was a small, nervous man named Porter who smelled of tobacco and old paper, and who had received her request with the particular blend of skepticism and mild condescension that she had long since learned to move through without losing her composure. He had gone to look for the deed registry from 1871 and come back 15 minutes later with the news that the record for that year was missing. Not misfiled, not incomplete, missing. Maggie had asked him to look again. He had. It was still missing. He had then told her, with the air of a man delivering unwelcome news that was not his fault, that the 1871 registry had been signed out 3 weeks ago by a representative of a land development firm out of Austin. He had the sign-out log right here. The firm's name was Crenshaw and Associates. She had stood in the recorder's office for a moment absorbing this information. Crenshaw had been here before her. He had known about the covenant clause, which meant either Douglas had told him, or he had obtained the original deed somehow and read it. Either way, the document she had come to Redemption Creek to retrieve was now in the hands of the man who was trying to steal her father's property. She had thanked Porter and walked back out into the morning sun, and stood on the wooden sidewalk of Redemption Creek, feeling the particular coldness of a trap that has just closed. And she had understood with perfect clarity that she was not going to be on a stage back to San Antonio at the end of the week. She had been standing there for perhaps 5 minutes when the man walked out of the sheriff's office across the street. He was tall, with the kind of build that came from actual physical labor rather than performance, broad across the shoulders and long in the leg, wearing a plain brown vest over a white shirt that had been neatly laundered. He had a badge on the vest. He had dark hair under a gray hat and a face that was not conventionally handsome, but was arresting in a way that had to do with its quality of attention, the way his eyes moved across the street with a measuring alertness that was not suspicious, but was entirely awake. He looked to be somewhere in his mid-30s, though the Texas sun made these assessments imprecise. He had noticed her standing on the sidewalk immediately. She watched him clock the travel skirt, the reticule, the expression that she was working to keep neutral, and then he had crossed the street with a directness that was not aggressive but was entirely purposeful. "You look like someone who just got news they weren't expecting," he had said, and his voice had been straightforward and without performance. Maggie had not intended to tell him anything. She had learned, over 4 years of running her father's shop as a woman in a man's commercial world, that information was leverage, and that giving it away without knowing where it would land was a form of vulnerability she could not afford. But something about the quality of his attention had caused her to take a second look at him, and the second look had told her something that the first had only suggested. This was not a man who was asking a question in order to involve himself in something that would benefit him. He was asking because he had noticed she was troubled, and the noticing had been genuine. "My name is Maggie Ramsey," she had said instead of anything else. "I need to find someone who can help me locate a document that has been improperly removed from the county recorder's office." He had considered that for a moment. "Simon Merritt," he had said, extending his hand. "And that sounds like a matter for the sheriff." She had shaken his hand and thought that this was either the best thing that had happened to her in 3 weeks or the beginning of another layer of complication, and she had not yet been able to tell which. That had been yesterday morning. What had followed was a day of conversation that had begun as purely practical, a sheriff and a woman with a legal problem working through the available information, and had gradually, without either of them appearing to intend it, become something else. Simon Merritt was the kind of man who listened when someone spoke, and who asked questions that were never about filling silence, but always about understanding more precisely. He had asked Maggie to tell him everything, and she had told him everything, all of it, the letter, the fraud, the forged deed, Douglas Hale's calculated courtship, Crenshaw's network, the missing registry, all of it. And he had listened to all of it without the particular expression of disbelief or concern that men often produced when women described being deceived, the expression that communicated something about whose fault it really was. He had listened as though she was describing a situation with clearly wrongful actors, and he was determining how to address it, which was exactly what was happening. He had told her that he knew the name Crenshaw. He had told her that Crenshaw had operated in the region before, and that there had been complaints, though nothing had ever been formally filed because the intimidation associated with filing was significant, and because the territorial judge in Austin had a reputation for making complaints against Crenshaw disappear before they reached proper hearing. He had told her that the sign-out of the county records was worth investigating, because there were specific rules about who could remove original documents and under what authority. He had also told her, toward the end of that afternoon, that there was a minister in Redemption Creek named Reverend Cole who had known Owen Ramsey personally, had conducted business with him in the 1870s, and who was the kind of man who kept meticulous records of everything, including property transactions he had witnessed. He had suggested they go see Reverend Cole in the morning. That was why Maggie was at the church. That was the reason she had walked down the main street in the early morning heat and found herself standing at the church door with her hand half raised, unsure. Not unsure about going in. Unsure about something larger, something that had been growing since the previous afternoon in Simon Merritt's office, something that had to do with the way she had felt sitting across from him, while he took her situation as seriously as she took it herself, something that had to do with the particular betrayal of Douglas Hale and what it had done to her ability to trust anyone with anything that mattered. And whether she was standing at a church door in a town she barely knew because of a legal document or because some part of her was already reaching toward the man who had opened his office door yesterday morning with the same direct purposefulness with which he had just opened this one. And then the door had opened before she could knock, and Simon Merritt had been standing there looking at her with an expression that was not surprise, and the question of why that shook her so deeply was the question of whether she was capable, after everything, of believing that someone had been waiting for her and that the waiting was not a trap. "I heard footsteps stop," he said, answering the question she hadn't asked yet. And then silence. "I figured it was either you working up to knocking or someone I needed to be concerned about. I preferred the first option." Maggie stepped inside. The church was cool and quiet, holding the morning air in the way old wooden buildings did, and it smelled of candle wax and cedar. Reverend Cole was seated in one of the front pews, a small, white-haired man with the alert eyes of someone who had been paying attention to the world for a long time and found it consistently interesting. He rose when she entered and extended his hand with a warmth that was entirely genuine. "Miss Ramsey," he said, "Simon told me your father's name. Owen Ramsey." "I knew Owen well. Come and sit down." There was a moment, as Maggie took her place in the pew across from Reverend Cole with Simon Merritt settling onto the pew beside her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cool church air, when she thought that she had arrived somewhere she had not intended to be and that she could not entirely predict what would happen here. The thought was not frightening. That was what surprised her. After the weeks of fear and calculation, and the grinding exhaustion of carrying a secret that felt like it weighed her father's entire legacy, the thought of not being able to predict what came next felt, briefly and startlingly, like freedom. Reverend Cole had known Owen Ramsey from a period when Owen had been establishing his trade routes through the hill country, before the family's move to San Antonio. He had been a character witness when Owen had filed the original property deed in 1871, which had been registered in Redemption Creek, because Owen had been conducting business there at the time and it had been the nearest county seat. More importantly, Reverend Cole was a careful man, and careful men kept records. He went to the back room of the church and returned with a wooden box that he set on the pew beside him, and from it he produced a leather-bound journal from 1871 that contained, in meticulous handwriting, a witnessed accounting of every property transaction he had been party to that year. Owen Ramsey's deed registration was there, dated April 14, 1871, including the specific covenant clause that Harold Birch had told Maggie to find. Reverend Cole had written it out in full in the journal, the covenant number, the precise legal language, and a note that he had countersigned the registration as a witness. It was not the original document, but it was a witnessed, dated, contemporaneous record that predated any of Crenshaw's machinations by over a decade, written in the hand of a man who had no financial interest in the matter and whose reputation in the county was, Simon told her quietly, impeccable. Would you be willing to provide a sworn affidavit to a San Antonio attorney? Maggie asked Reverend Cole. I would be willing to provide whatever is necessary, Reverend Cole said, to ensure that Owen Ramsey's daughter is not robbed of what her father built. Maggie had to look down at her hands for a moment. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was not going to cry now, but something in the plainness of his statement had moved through her defenses with a force that surprised her. Simon Merritt said nothing. He did not, she noticed, attempt to say something bracing or to redirect her composure. He simply sat beside her in the quiet church and let her feel what she was feeling, which was, she thought, one of the rarer forms of respect. The question was what to do next. The original registry was in Crenshaw's hands, which meant he knew about the covenant clause. He had presumably removed the registry to prevent exactly what Maggie was attempting to do. Reverend Cole's journal entry was powerful, but a clever attorney in Austin might argue its admissibility without the original. They needed more. Simon had been thinking about this. She could tell because he had the particular quality of focused quiet that she was already learning to distinguish from general silence. He had been thinking about it since the night before, she suspected, because when he spoke it was with the precision of someone who had worked through several angles before selecting one. Crenshaw's representative came through here 3 weeks ago, he said. Porter at the recorder's office let him take the registry because he had a court order from the territorial judge. That court order will have been filed. It will have a case number. If we can get the case number, Harold Birch in San Antonio can file a countermotion in the federal court rather than the territorial court, which removes it from the judge Crenshaw has in his pocket. Maggie looked at him. The territorial judge issued a court order to remove an original public record from a county recorder's office, she said carefully. Yes, that is itself a legal irregularity. It is, Simon said. And federal circuit judges find territorial irregularities interesting, particularly when there's a pattern. He paused. Crenshaw has done this in 4 other counties that I know of. I've been collecting reports. I had not yet had grounds to send them anywhere useful. Maggie understood what he was saying. She had walked into his town carrying the piece he had been missing. The fraud against her father's property was not an isolated act. It was part of a system, and what she had, with Reverend Cole's journal and the paper trail from San Antonio and Simon's accumulated reports, was potentially enough to bring the system down. You have been working on this, she said. For about a year, he confirmed. Carefully, because being careful is the difference between doing something useful and getting buried in a countersuit filed by a man with a judge in his pocket. This was the moment, she would think later, when the shift happened, when it became something more than a legal problem and a professional alliance. It was not a dramatic moment. He was not looking at her with particular intensity. He was looking at Reverend Cole's journal with the expression of a man reviewing available information. But she was aware, with a clarity that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the part of her that had spent 3 weeks feeling completely alone, that this man had been working in the same dark, careful way she had, fighting against the same pattern of predation, and that the fact that they had found each other was not coincidence, but was also not something she could name with any greater precision than that. They spent the morning at the church. Reverend Cole produced coffee from a small stove in the back room, and the three of them worked through what they had, organizing it with the thoroughness of people who understood that a good case was a matter of detail and sequence. Simon had his reports in his office and went to retrieve them while Maggie worked with Reverend Cole on the precise wording of his affidavit. When Simon returned with a file folder of documents that he set on the pew between them, and she saw the extent of what he had assembled, she felt something that was partly admiration and partly something more complicated, a recognition of a quality in him that she had not expected to find in a sheriff in a small Texas town. "This is meticulous," she said, looking at the documents. "I had a good teacher," he said. "My father was a lawyer, died when I was 24. He said it without self-pity, just as information. I went west rather than practice law because I wanted to be useful in a more direct way, but the habit stuck." Maggie looked at him for a moment. "How old are you now?" 34, he said. "You?" 26, she said. He nodded. Nothing about his expression shifted, but something in the air between them settled slightly, as though a question had been quietly answered without either of them having technically asked it. They ate lunch at the hotel, which was also the best dining establishment in Redemption Creek, a fact Maggie had already established. Over plates of beef and cornbread, they talked about things that were not the legal matter, which happened naturally, and without either of them manufacturing the shift. She told him about her father, about the shop, about the particular education of running a business as a woman in San Antonio in the 1880s. He told her about Redemption Creek, about how he had arrived 7 years ago and found a town that was in the process of either establishing itself properly or collapsing into lawlessness, and had decided to help it toward the former option. He had done it mostly by being consistent, by being fair, and by never taking a bribe, which sounded simple and was not. "Do you miss the city?" she asked. He considered the question seriously. "No," he said. "I think I am a person who needs to see the direct consequence of what I do. The law is abstract enough in theory. In practice here, when it works, I can see it working in the faces of people I know. That is worth something to me." Maggie thought about her father's shop, about the particular satisfaction of watching something her father built continue to exist and grow because of the work she did every day. "Yes," she said, "I understand that." They looked at each other for a moment across the hotel table, and the look was not complicated, but it was not simple either. It was the look of two people who have recognized something mutual and are deciding what to do about it. What they did that afternoon was work. They went to Simon's office and spent 3 hours organizing the documents into a package that could be sent to Harold Birch in San Antonio by the morning stage. Simon wrote a cover letter that was precise and authoritative, laying out the pattern of fraud and the specific legal vulnerabilities in Crenshaw's operation, and Maggie added her own account of the San Antonio fraud in language that was clear and chronological, and entirely without the kind of emotional register that she knew made men with power dismiss women's testimony. She had learned this the hard way. When they had finished, Simon sealed the package and Maggie sat back in the chair across from his desk and felt the particular exhaustion of a body that has been running on fear and determination for 3 weeks and has finally, briefly, been allowed to stop. "You should eat dinner and sleep," Simon said, observing this with the straightforwardness she was coming to expect from him. "The stage leaves at 6. We will have it ready." "I should send a telegraph to Harold Birch tonight," she said, "to tell him it is coming." "The telegraph office is open until 8, he said. "We have time." She looked at him. "You keep saying we." He met her eyes. "Is that a problem?" She thought about it for a genuine moment. The last man who had made her feel accompanied and supported had been building a trap out of her trust. She was aware of this. She was aware that the fear it had left behind was not irrational, but was also not an accurate guide to the man sitting across from her. She had spent the day watching Simon Merritt operate, watching him be honest about what he knew and what he did not know, watching him treat her assessment of the situation as equally valid to his own, watching him be precisely what he appeared to be with a consistency that was either entirely genuine or the most sophisticated deception she had ever encountered. She believed it was genuine. She was also aware that she was 26 years old and had recently learned a hard lesson about the difference between believing and knowing. "No," she said. "It is not a problem." The telegraph was sent. Dinner was eaten, this time at the hotel's small dining room with fewer other guests, which meant quieter, which meant the conversation went somewhere different. He asked about her childhood, about what her father had been like, and she told him stories that she had not told anyone in years because her mother was gone now too, had died in the second winter after Owen, and there was no one left who had known the family in those earlier years. Simon listened in the way that he always listened, which was to say with his full attention and without the performing of attention, and the stories came out of her more easily than she had expected, and by the time the meal was finished, she was aware that she felt lighter than she had in months. She also felt, walking back across the main street in the warm night air with Simon beside her, that she was in a great deal of trouble of a different variety entirely. "I will be leaving tomorrow," she said. It came out slightly more abruptly than she had intended. "After the stage is away," he said. "Yes," she paused, "though I will likely need to return. If Reverend Cole's affidavit needs to be sworn before the county clerk here rather than in San Antonio." "He can do that here," Simon said. "I can ensure it is properly filed and witnessed. I will send word when it is done." "That is," she searched for the right word, "generous." "It is my job," he said, and then, after a brief pause, "most of it." They had stopped in front of the hotel. The night sky over Redemption Creek was extraordinary. The way the sky was in places far from city lights, a dense scatter of stars that made the darkness feel inhabited rather than empty. Maggie had grown up in San Antonio and was not accustomed to this particular species of night sky. "It is remarkable," she said, looking up. "Yes," Simon said, and she was not certain he was looking at the sky. She looked at him. He was, in fact, looking at the sky, but when he brought his gaze back down, he met hers without evasion and with an expression that was composed and honest and that contained, she thought, the same careful restraint she was exercising herself. "Thank you," she said, "for today, for all of it. Let me know what Harold Birch says," he said. "And be careful in San Antonio until the injunction is filed. Crenshaw is not violent, as far as I know, but Douglas Hale is an unknown quantity, and the exposure of a fraud this size has a way of making unknown quantities behave unpredictably." It was not what she had expected him to say. She had expected something social, some closing of the evening's conversation in the register of the dinner they had just had. Instead, he had gone directly to her safety, practically and without drama, and the straightforwardness of it moved through her chest with a warmth she was not going to examine too closely at this particular moment. "I will be careful," she said. "Good night, Maggie." "Good night, Simon." She went upstairs. She lay in the hotel bed under the single ceiling lamp and listened to the quiet sounds of Redemption Creek settling into its evening, and she thought about the peculiar quality of days that end in a completely different place than they began, not geographically, but in every other sense that mattered. Yesterday morning, she had been standing in the county recorder's office, understanding that the document she needed had been taken. Tonight she had a path forward, a powerful ally, and a package on its way to Harold Birch that could very plausibly end this. She had also, somewhere in the middle of all of that, been seen with such completeness by a man she had known for one day, that the memory of it was going to be significantly more complicated to leave behind than the legal matter was to resolve. She was on the morning stage to San Antonio. The following 2 weeks were the hardest of the entire ordeal, not because the legal situation deteriorated, but because it hung, suspended, in the particular uncertainty of official processes, grinding forward at the pace official processes always ground. Harold Birch received the package. Harold Birch sent a reply by telegraph that was 3 sentences long and constituted the closest thing to enthusiasm she had ever received from Harold Birch. He had filed the injunction in the Federal Circuit Court within 48 hours. The circuit judge had issued a stay on the property transfer while the matter was reviewed. Crenshaw's attorneys had filed an immediate objection. The county recorder, Porter, had received a visit from a man whose description matched someone Crenshaw used as a messenger. Harold Birch received a strongly worded letter, suggesting he withdraw the injunction in the interest of avoiding complications. Harold Birch had sent the letter directly to the Federal Circuit Court as evidence of attempted intimidation. Douglas Hale, Maggie did not see. He had been warned, apparently, that the fraud had been discovered, and he had left San Antonio with a rapidity that suggested he had always known this day might come and had kept his travel bag accordingly packed. His departure was both a relief and its own particular kind of wound, not because she missed him, but because his absence removed the last possibility of misunderstanding. It had been entirely deliberate, all of it. She was managing the shop, keeping up with the ordinary business of it, and doing all of this with the specific discipline of someone who knows that falling apart is a luxury the situation does not currently permit. Her neighbor, a widow named Clara Vance who had known her parents and who had been watching over Maggie with increasing concern for the past year, came by one evening with a pot of stew and stayed for 2 hours and said, among other things, "You need to let yourself feel this eventually, child. The anger and the hurt, carrying them sealed up is what makes them leak." Maggie had thought about that for a long time. She had also, in the second week, received a letter from Redemption Creek. It was not from Reverend Cole, though his sworn affidavit had arrived properly through Harold Birch's office by that point. It was written in a clear, slanted hand that she recognized even though she had only seen it once, on the cover letter of the document package. It was 2 pages long and concerned, ostensibly, a development in the Crenshaw investigation. Simon had identified a 5th county that matched the pattern and had sent a report to the federal marshal's office in Austin. He had also located a former associate of Crenshaw's who was willing to provide testimony regarding the systematic nature of the fraud, which would significantly strengthen the case against not just the property transfer, but against Crenshaw's entire operation. All of this was useful and professional and presented with appropriate clarity. At the end of the second page, after the professional content was concluded, there was one additional paragraph that was set apart from the rest by a space, and that read as follows. "I find that I think frequently about the conversation we had regarding the work of maintaining something your father built. The particular satisfaction you described has stayed with me. I hope the shop is continuing well and that San Antonio is being less difficult than it has reason to be. The sky here last night was, for what it is worth, again remarkable. S.M." Maggie had read that paragraph 4 times and then placed the letter in the box on her desk where she kept correspondence that required careful responses. She had written back the same evening. It was also 2 pages, mostly professional, with 1 paragraph at the end that was set apart by a space. This was how it continued for the next 3 weeks. The legal situation resolved faster than Harold Birch had anticipated, which was to say it resolved in 6 weeks rather than 3 months, because the pattern evidence Simon had provided, and the testimony of Crenshaw's former associate, gave the Federal Circuit Court enough to act on with unusual speed. Crenshaw was indicted on 11 counts of land fraud spanning 3 states. The territorial judge in Austin was quietly removed from his bench pending investigation. The property transfer affecting the Ramsey store was declared null and void, and the original deed restored to full standing. The forged documents in Douglas Hale's name were voided, and Hale was named in a civil suit that Harold Birch filed on Maggie's behalf, though Hale's current location made the suit largely symbolic. On a Thursday morning in late September 1884, Harold Birch had come to the shop and placed the restored deed on the counter in front of Maggie and told her that the matter was concluded. She had thanked him and shaken his hand and seen him out, and then she had stood alone in her father's shop with the deed in her hands, and she had cried, which she had not done for the entire 3 months of the ordeal, not once, not even after reading Douglas Hale's letter with its casual assessment of her trust as an exploitable resource. She had cried now, not from grief exactly, but from the release of something that had been held so tightly for so long that letting it go felt physical. Clara Vance had been right. You had to feel it eventually. She had felt it that afternoon. And then, in the evening, she had sat down and written a letter to Redemption Creek. That was the first one that did not have a professional occasion. That was simply a letter. And in it, she had told Simon that the matter was resolved and the deed was restored. And she had told him about crying in the shop. And she had told him about her father. And she had told him that she thought she would like to come back to Redemption Creek at some point if there was a reason to. The letter she received in return had been written with the same careful restraint that characterized everything about Simon Merritt. But the restraint had a quality to it now of something that was being held carefully rather than something that was simply absent. And toward the end he had said, with a plainness that she suspected cost him something to write, that there was a reason if she chose to see it as one, and that he thought she might. She had thought about it for 2 weeks, not about whether she wanted to go. She had known that with a clarity that required no deliberation. She had thought about what it meant to go, about what she was reaching toward, about whether it was wise or whether wisdom was even the correct standard to apply. She had thought about Douglas Hale and what he had done to her ability to trust her own instincts about people. She had thought about the fact that Simon Merritt had, over the course of a single day and several weeks of correspondence, shown her something that felt more real than anything Douglas Hale had shown her in a year. She had thought about Reverend Cole and the wooden box and her father's name written in careful handwriting in 1871. She had booked passage on the Thursday stage to Redemption Creek. And now it was the following Thursday morning, and she was standing in front of the Redemption Creek Community Church with her hand half raised, and her heart conducting something acrobatic in her chest. And the door had opened, and Simon Merritt was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands and an expression that was not surprise. And the question of whether she was going to step through it had been answered the moment she had seen his face. Because the thing about a man who waited was that the waiting told you something nothing else could. She stepped through the door. "Reverend Cole," Simon said, leading her to where the old man was seated in the front pew with his journal and a cup of coffee, "wanted to see you when you returned. He has something he wants to tell you himself." Reverend Cole rose and took her hands in both of his with the warmth of a man who has known your family and takes the continuation of families seriously. "Your father was a fine man," he said, "and I am glad what he built is still standing. But I wanted to tell you something he told me the day he registered that deed." He settled back into the pew and gestured for her to sit. "He told me that the most important things he had built in his life were not the shop and not the property. He said they were the people who would come after him. He said he hoped that whoever Maggie became, she would have someone beside her who deserved her." Maggie sat very still. "He said she was the kind of woman who would need someone with a backbone equal to her own," Reverend Cole continued, with the hint of a smile. "I don't think he was wrong." Simon, seated beside her again in that same quiet proximity as 3 months ago, said nothing. He did not need to. The particular quality of his silence was the quality of a man who was letting something important happen without inserting himself into it, which was, Maggie thought, precisely the quality her father had been describing. She looked at Simon. He was looking at her with the expression that was not surprise and not performance and not the calculated attention of a man who knew he was being observed. It was simply his face, simply the full attention he brought to everything that mattered to him, and it was directed at her with a steadiness that made the 3 months of careful letters and careful restraint suddenly unnecessary in a way that felt like relief. "I thought about not coming," she told him honestly. "I know," he said. Not because I did not want to. I know that too, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was very gentle. Douglas Hale was. She stopped. She had not planned to say this out loud in a church with Reverend Cole sitting 4 feet away, but Reverend Cole had, she noticed, become very interested in his coffee cup. What he did. It made it difficult to trust that what I was seeing was what was actually there. Simon nodded. He did not rush to reassure her or to offer counter-evidence about his own character. He simply nodded, as though what she was saying was reasonable and he could wait for her to finish it. "But I do trust it," she said. "I have looked at it carefully and I trust it." She paused. "I trust you." The silence afterward was the best kind of silence, the kind that is not empty but is full of something that has just been given and received properly. "I am glad you came back," Simon said. It was not a grand statement. It was not particularly eloquent. It was entirely true, and she could hear the truth in it the way you can hear the difference between a struck bell and a recorded one. "I have been wanting to say things to you that did not fit in letters." "Tell me," Maggie said. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man selecting between several true things, and then he said, "From the first morning, when you were standing on the sidewalk outside the recorder's office, and you told me about the fraud with your face set against showing fear when you were clearly afraid, I thought you were the bravest person I had seen in a long time. And I thought that the man who had used your trust as a vulnerability had done something I found very difficult to forgive. Not only on your behalf, though primarily on your behalf, but also because the thing he had treated as a weakness was in fact the opposite of a weakness." Maggie looked at her hands for a moment. "Reverend Cole," she said, "you are still here." "I am," Reverend Cole agreed cheerfully, "though I can find something to do in the back room." "Please," Maggie said. Reverend Cole took his coffee and his journal and retreated with admirable speed. In the quiet of the church, with the morning light falling through the plain glass windows and the smell of candle wax and cedar around them, Maggie turned to face Simon properly, and he turned to face her, and there was no longer any distance between what they had been carefully carrying for 3 months and what they were now allowing to simply be present. "I have thought about you every day since I left," she said. "I want you to know that, not because it is convenient or because the legal situation created a connection. I have thought about you because I have not been able to stop, and I have tried because I was not certain that what I was feeling was not simply gratitude or relief after a very difficult situation, and I needed to be sure." "And," he said, "it is not gratitude," she said, "or not only. It is considerably more specific than that." He reached out and took her hand in the careful way of a man who is not taking anything for granted, and the warmth of his hand was solid and real and entirely unlike anything she associated with performance or strategy. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you would permit it." "I am in Redemption Creek," she said, "and you are in Redemption Creek. I think that is a reasonable beginning." He smiled. It transformed his face in the particular way of smiles that come from somewhere genuine, and she felt it move through her with the peculiar warmth of something that was going to matter for a long time. She stayed in Redemption Creek, not indefinitely at first. She went back to San Antonio twice over the following 2 months to manage the shop through the transition, because she was not the kind of woman who abandoned a responsibility, and because she needed to make real decisions about the future rather than allowing happiness to make them for her. Clara Vance managed the shop during her absences with the efficiency of a woman who had been waiting to be given something useful to do and who was, Maggie suspected, deeply invested in her leaving. The business of closing up the San Antonio house and arranging for the shop to be managed on a permanent basis by a capable young man named Thomas Pryor, whom she had trained over the previous year and who was entirely honest, took longer than expected and required 3 trips and 1 very long weekend with an attorney. Meanwhile, between these trips, she was in Redemption Creek. The courtship of Simon Merritt and Maggie Ramsey was not theatrical. It was conducted in the way that both of them conducted most things, with genuine attention and without performance. He took her to dinner at the hotel. He showed her the country around the town on horseback, and she turned out to ride well enough that this surprised him, which she enjoyed. She attended the Sunday services at Reverend Cole's church. She met the people of Redemption Creek gradually, the storekeeper Whitfield and his wife, the doctor named Fellows who was irascible and brilliant in equal measure, the livery owner Martinez who had built his business from nothing and was fiercely proud of it, the schoolteacher Margaret Frome who was perhaps 30 and unmarried, and who looked at Maggie with the bright focused gaze of someone who was deciding whether a potential friendship was worth her time, and concluded within a single conversation that it was. The town received Maggie with the particular wariness and welcome that small towns reserved for women who arrived with unclear intention and then demonstrated that the intention was good. She was direct and capable and genuinely curious about the people she met, and these qualities were recognized for what they were even in communities where the reception of strangers was cautious. She had also, she was aware, arrived with the story of the Crenshaw fraud, and stories in small towns traveled faster than stages. The people of Redemption Creek knew that she had brought Simon the missing piece of a case that had troubled him for a year, and they had formed opinions about her based on this, and the opinions were favorable. What the courtship was, fundamentally, was a deepening of the thing that had begun in a single day in August when two people had sat in a sheriff's office working through available information, and discovered, in the space of that work, that they were the kind of people whose working minds were compatible in the same way that their characters were, which was to say entirely, and with the ease of things that belong together. He told her things he did not tell people. Not secrets in the dramatic sense, but the quiet architecture of a person's interior, the things that mattered and the things that did not, and the way he had arrived at these assessments through experience. She told him in return, and found that the telling was not the exposure she had feared after Douglas Hale, but was instead the specific relief of being known by someone who took the knowing seriously. He kissed her for the first time on an evening in October, on the porch of the house he rented behind the main street, under a sky that was doing its usual remarkable thing with the stars. It was not a spontaneous event. They had both been aware of it approaching for approximately 45 minutes of quiet conversation, and the particular electricity of two people deciding together without words that now is the time. And when it happened, it was with a tenderness and a care that was entirely characteristic of him, and she kissed him back with the specific intention of making sure he understood that she was fully present and not afraid. She had told him afterward, with her forehead against his shoulder in the cool October air, that she had not expected to be here. Not in Redemption Creek, not in this exact configuration of her life. She had expected at 26 to be managing her father's shop in San Antonio indefinitely, and she had been at peace with that expectation, or had told herself she was. And now, he had said quietly, "Now I think peace was not quite the right word for what that was," she had said. He had understood what she meant without requiring further explanation. She moved to Redemption Creek permanently in November. The shop in San Antonio was left in Thomas Pryor's capable hands with a formal arrangement that provided her with income from the business, while Thomas managed its operations, which satisfied her conscience on the matter of abandonment, and also gave her the financial independence that she was not willing to surrender for any reason, a condition Simon had never suggested she should. He had in fact been the one to suggest the management arrangement when she had been wrestling with the logistics, which told her something important about the kind of partnership he was offering. She found a room at first with Margaret Frome, who had a house with a spare room and who was, as Maggie had correctly identified, a person worth knowing, sharp and funny, and possessed of strong opinions that she delivered without apology, which Maggie found entirely refreshing. The town continued. The seasons shifted. The work of living in a place and becoming part of it proceeded in the way that it always did, through the accumulation of small events and ordinary conversations, and the gradual development of the kind of knowledge that can only come from being present over time. Simon proposed to her in February of 1885, on a Sunday evening after dinner at the hotel, not with elaborate ceremony, but with the directness that characterized him. A question asked plainly with his eyes entirely steady on hers, with the admission that he had thought carefully about the asking, and was certain of it, and wanted her to be certain too before she answered, and that if she needed more time she should take it. She had looked at him across the hotel table for a moment, this man who had opened a door before she could knock and waited for her on the other side of it for 3 months, who had treated her situation as seriously as she treated it, who had listened as though her words mattered and disagreed with her sometimes, and told her the truth even when it was complicated, who was exactly what he appeared to be with a consistency that had taken her some time to trust, and that she now trusted completely. No, she had said, he had been very still. I do not need more time, she had clarified, because she had watched his expression for the single second before she clarified, and she felt slightly guilty about it. I mean yes. The answer is yes. The expression that had crossed his face in that second was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on it, and it made her love him, the specific word occurring to her with the specific force of something arriving rather than being selected, more than anything else that had happened between them, because it told her what was underneath the careful composure and the steady waiting. And what was underneath? It was a man who wanted this very much, and who had been holding that wanting with both hands while she decided. They were married in May of 1885 in Reverend Cole's church. The wedding was small because both of them preferred it that way. 20 people in the pews, Margaret Frome standing beside Maggie. The town's principal citizens gathered in the spring morning with the church windows open, and the smell of May coming in from outside. Maggie wore a dress that had been her mother's, altered by a seamstress in town to fit her, cream-colored cotton with embroidery at the cuffs that she had always loved. Simon wore his good suit and no badge, which she had asked for because she wanted the afternoon to be about them rather than about the office, and he had agreed without discussion. Reverend Cole conducted the ceremony with the warmth of a man who felt that he had some personal investment in the occasion, which he did, having known her father, and having been present for the first morning when everything had begun. He kept it simple and meaningful, and did not embellish. When he said the part about the joining of 2 lives into a shared one, he looked at both of them with an expression that was entirely satisfied, as though something had arrived at its proper conclusion. When Simon said his vows, he said them in the same voice he used for everything that mattered to him, which was quiet and direct and entirely without performance. And looking at him while he said them, Maggie felt the particular weight of a moment that is exactly what it should be, no more and no less, and thought that her father, who had believed in the covenant value of the right document with the right witness, would have understood what this was. She said her own vows with the same quality of directness, and she saw in his eyes what she had seen in those unguarded seconds in February, the thing underneath the composure, and she was glad that it was visible to her now, and that she had helped make it visible by being willing to come back to a church door in August and step through it. They rode out to a small property Simon had bought 2 miles outside of town on the spring afternoon after the wedding, a house he had been quietly working on for 3 months, not large but solid, with a porch that faced west and caught the evening light and the extraordinary sky. He had planted a kitchen garden in the back that was not yet producing. Maggie stood on the porch and looked at the country around her, the rolling hills and the cedar and the hawks turning slow circles in the high blue air, and felt the specific quality of peace that is not resignation but is arrival. I want to plant roses on the south side, she told him. We can do that in September, he said, leaning in the doorway behind her. And I want to keep the books on the prior arrangement myself, she said. I am not relinquishing the accounts. I would not suggest it, he said. And I want Maggie, he said. Yes, you can want as many things as you want, he said. That is the point. She turned and looked at him in the doorway of their house, and thought that the man she had almost not come back to, had almost let the fear from one man's betrayal cost her by misapplying it to a different and better man, was standing in her life now with the solidity of something that was going to be there in the morning and the morning after that, and that the accumulation of those mornings was what people meant when they talked about building something together. She crossed the porch and kissed him in the May afternoon light, and he held her with the particular quality of holding that was not possession but was presence, and the distinction mattered enormously, and she felt it in the way he held her. The summer was good. The marriage settled into the rhythms of a shared life, the way good things settle, not without adjustment, not without the occasional friction of two independent-minded people whose habits had been formed separately over decades, but with the fundamental ease of people who are working with rather than against each other. Maggie established her office space in the second bedroom of the house, keeping the account books for the San Antonio shop and beginning, as the months passed, to provide bookkeeping services for several Redemption Creek businesses whose owners had recognized her competence and made inquiries. Simon continued his work with the same steady thoroughness that had characterized it before she arrived, and she was learning, slowly, what that work actually consisted of day to day, which was more ordinary and more demanding than its dramatics suggested, and which he conducted with an evenness that she admired. Margaret Frome came to dinner on Fridays. Dr. Fellows came occasionally, was irascible, and was deeply interested in Maggie's opinion of everything, which she provided with matching directness to his evident satisfaction. The Martinez family invited them for the celebrations associated with the feast days they observed, and Maggie went with genuine interest and came home with the recipes for 3 things she then had to learn to make properly, which took several attempts and produced, on one occasion, a kitchen incident that Simon witnessed with an expression of extreme composure that she recognized as his version of trying not to laugh. She let him laugh eventually. It was, she thought, important to let people laugh at the right moments. In the autumn, the roses were planted on the south side of the house as planned. They were the pink prairie roses that grew native in the region, hardy and fragrant and not fussy, which suited both of them. Maggie discovered she was pregnant in the January of 1886. She told Simon on a Tuesday evening after supper, simply and directly, and his response was the expression that she had come to think of as his real face, the one underneath the composure, which appeared at the moments of most significance and which was, in this instance, something that moved through joy and tenderness in rapid succession before settling into a kind of luminous steadiness. He put both hands on her face and looked at her for a long moment and said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said, and kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then sat back and looked at her as though he was revising his understanding of something in a way that was entirely positive. She had her first child in September of 1886, a boy. He was born at the house with Dr. Fellows in attendance and Margaret Frome, who had delivered several babies in her life, and who was possessed of a bracing practicality in difficult moments that Maggie found exactly what she needed. Simon was in the house through the whole of it, which Fellows grumbled about and which Maggie had no intention of negotiating. The child was born at noon on a Tuesday, healthy and loud, with Simon's dark coloring and a pair of lungs that Dr. Fellows pronounced sufficient. They named him Owen Simon Merritt. Reverend Cole, who had been waiting at the church for news, came out to the house that afternoon and held the baby with the practiced ease of a man who had held a great many babies over a long ministry, and looked at him with the expression of a man who is seeing something conclude and begin at the same time. "Owen," he said, "your father would have liked that very much." Maggie thought, in the warmth of the afternoon bedroom with the sound of Reverend Cole's voice, and the weight of the baby against her, and Simon sitting on the edge of the bed, holding her hand with the steady warmth that was so specifically his, that her father had told Reverend Cole she was the kind of woman who would need someone with a backbone equal to her own, and that the man holding her hand had proven this with considerable consistency, and that the document her father had filed in this very town in 1871, with Reverend Cole as witness, had in a completely unplanned and entirely human way brought her here, to this specific afternoon, to this specific man, to this specific child named. For her father, she thought that her father would have found this remarkable. She thought he would have been right. Little Owen was 3 years old when Maggie discovered she was expecting again. This second pregnancy was easier than the first in most respects, though she worked straight through it at her accounts and did not let it slow her down to any significant degree, which Dr. Fellows complained about and Simon supported, having learned that advising Maggie to slow down was approximately as effective as advising the creek behind the property to flow uphill. The second child arrived in the spring of 1890, another boy, which was not what anyone had been predicting based on Margaret Frome's theories about the shape of things. They named him Thomas Revere Merritt, Thomas for Thomas Pryor, whose honest management of the San Antonio shop had been a significant factor in Maggie's ability to build the life she had built, and Revere because Simon had a long-standing admiration for the qualities of purposefulness and alarm-sounding that he felt the name implied, and that he thought were underrated virtues. Owen greeted his brother with the solemnity of a 3-year-old who has been told he is now a significant person in someone else's life and is taking the responsibility seriously. He inspected the baby at length and delivered the verdict that he was acceptable, which Dr. Fellows thought was funny and Margaret Frome thought was entirely correct. The Crenshaw case had its final resolution that same spring. The Federal Circuit Court had worked through the full indictment over the intervening years, and the final judgment came down in March of 1890, 12 counts of land fraud confirmed, significant penalties and restitution ordered, and the territorial judge who had issued the order removing Owen Ramsey's registry from the Redemption Creek courthouse was formally censured and permanently removed from the bench. The registry itself, the original document, was returned to the county recorder's office as part of the restitution process. Simon received the formal notice from the federal court on a Thursday and brought it home to Maggie that evening. She read it at the kitchen table while Thomas slept in his basket and Owen played on the floor, and the spring evening came through the open window. She read it carefully, all of it, and then she set it down and looked at it for a moment. "It is done," she said. "It is done," Simon confirmed. She thought about the Tuesday morning in June of 1884 when she had opened a letter by mistake and sat at her father's counter and felt the world rearrange itself without her permission. She thought about the stage to Redemption Creek and the county recorder's office, and standing on the sidewalk afterward, understanding that the document was gone. She thought about a man walking out of a sheriff's office and crossing the street and asking a question because he had noticed she was troubled and the noticing had been genuine. "I want to take this to show Reverend Cole," she said. "Tomorrow," Simon agreed. "He will want to see it." She folded the document carefully and set it on the desk beside the account books and looked at Simon, who was watching her with the expression that was his real face, which appeared more often now than it had when she had first arrived, because 3 years of a life built together had done what 3 years of a life built together always did to the spaces between two people, had filled them in and made them familiar and made the familiar precious. "Thank you," she said. He raised an eyebrow slightly, a question. "For crossing the street," she said, "in August of 1884, for crossing the street when you could have not." He was quiet for a moment. "You were standing on the sidewalk looking like someone who was not going to let whatever had happened stop her," he said. "I crossed the street because I wanted to help and because I wanted to know who you were. Both were true at the same time." "Both are still true?" she asked. "Considerably more so," he said. They went to see Reverend Cole the next morning, all 4 of them, which was to say Maggie and Simon and Owen, who could walk now with great speed in many incorrect directions, and Thomas in the carrier that Simon wore across his chest, with the matter-of-fact ease of a man who had decided that his children's comfort was a practical matter requiring practical solutions. The old man received them with the warmth he always did and read the federal court notice with concentrated attention, and then set it down and looked at the two of them over his reading glasses with an expression that was satisfied in the deepest possible sense. "Owen Ramsey's property is secure," he said. "Owen Ramsey's property is secure," Maggie confirmed. He looked at the boy playing on the church floor with a wooden horse Simon had carved for him in the winter, and at the baby on Simon's chest, and at the two of them standing together in the light of the church windows. "He would have been very pleased," Reverend Cole said simply, "with all of it." Maggie looked at her son on the floor, and at her other son sleeping against Simon's chest, and at Simon himself, who was looking at her, and she thought that all of it was not a comprehensive enough description of what she was standing in the middle of, because what she was standing in the middle of was the particular accumulation of trust and work and time that made a life into something more than its individual moments, and that the beginning of all of it had been a church door and a man who had been waiting. The thing about the waiting, she had come to understand, was that it had not been passive. It had not been the waiting of a man who simply hoped someone would arrive. It had been the waiting of a man who had made himself ready and stayed ready without knowing when or if the readiness would be called on, and when she had come it had been because she too had been becoming ready, through everything that had happened, through the betrayal and the fear and the legal fight and the careful management of her own heart in the aftermath. They had both arrived at that church door ready, and the door had opened, and they had stepped through it together. The roses on the south side of the house bloomed every summer. The kitchen garden produced more than it was possible to eat, and they gave away a great deal of it. Thomas Pryor ran the San Antonio shop with honesty and increasing competence, and wrote quarterly letters that were full of detail and occasional humor. The account books Maggie kept for the Redemption Creek businesses were accurate to the last cent. Margaret Frome married the circuit doctor who came through town in 1889. A kind and intelligent man named Harper who was worthy of her sharpness and matched it. And this development pleased Maggie enormously, not because she thought Margaret had needed it, but because Margaret was clearly happier than she had been before, which was the actual point of the thing. Owen Simon Merritt grew into a boy of particular seriousness and genuine curiosity, who asked questions with the same focused attention as his father and who had, his teacher told Maggie at the end of his first school year, a remarkable facility for understanding how things worked, which Maggie took as the highest possible compliment. Thomas Revere Merritt grew into a child of spectacular energy and strong opinion, who required significant management and who was, everyone agreed, going to be either very successful or very interesting, probably both. Reverend Cole retired from the ministry in 1892, citing his knees and his age, both of which were reasonable justifications, and the church found a younger minister who was earnest and willing, and who Reverend Cole mentored with the energy of a man who was not truly retiring but was redirecting. He spent a great deal of time at the Merritt house, which suited him and suited them. Simon was re-elected sheriff of Redemption Creek in 1886 and again in 1890, both times without significant opposition, because he was the kind of sheriff whose town did not want to lose him, which was as uncomplicated a professional endorsement as there was. He had turned down the offer of the federal marshal appointment in 1888, which had surprised the people who made the offer, and which he had explained to Maggie beforehand. And she had told him it was entirely his decision, and he had said he knew and had turned it down because Redemption Creek was where he was useful in the direct way that mattered to him, and because his children were 5 and 2, and the work of being their father was not a thing he was willing to reduce to evenings and Sundays. Maggie had kissed him for that. In the summer of 1893, they sat on the porch on a long evening with the sky doing its usual remarkable thing and Owen reading beside them, and Thomas asleep on Simon's lap at an age when he was entirely too large for laps, but had climbed there anyway and been permitted to stay. And Maggie looked at what was around her with the specific quality of attention she gave to things she wanted to remember completely. And she thought about a woman standing at a church door in the summer heat of August 1884, unsure, with a folded paper in her reticule and 3 months of fear in her body. And she thought about what it had taken to stand there, and what it had taken to stay, and what all of it had produced. It had produced this. This porch, this sky, this man with a child on his lap turning pages with the easy patience of someone who is exactly where he intends to be, this older child reading beside her, these roses, this house, this town that had received her and become hers, this life that was hers and was also shared and was better for the sharing. "Simon," she said. He looked over at her. "I'm going to want to plant more roses in September," she said. "On the north side this time." He considered this. "The north side does not get as much sun. There are roses that like shade," she said. "I expect you know which ones." "I do," she said. He smiled at her with his real face, unhidden, the way it always was now in these evenings on the porch, the warmth and the steadiness of a man who was fully present in his own life, and who found that life entirely sufficient. And she smiled back with the fullness of someone who had stood at a door unsure and stepped through and found, on the other side, everything she had not known she was going toward. The sky above Redemption Creek did its extraordinary thing with the stars, as it did every clear night, and the evening went on in the way that good evenings go, unhurried, containing everything it needed to contain, closing gently into night. Owen Ramsey's document, the original deed with the covenant clause, was framed on the wall of the Merritt house beside the window that caught the morning light. Below it, in a small frame that Maggie had found in the general store, was a note in Reverend Cole's handwriting from the journal, the entry from April 14, 1871, with Owen's name and the covenant number and the words she had read in a church pew in August of 1884 on a morning that had changed everything. Beside it, in a third frame that Simon had put up without comment one afternoon while she was doing the accounts, was the letter that had started all of it, Harold Birch's referral to the document in Redemption Creek, the letter she had read in the stage office in San Antonio before she had bought her ticket. The 3 frames together told the shape of a story that had its beginning in a father's care, and its middle in a woman's determination, and its turning point in a church door, and its continuation in all the days that followed. It was a story about a document. It was a story about fraud and the law and a federal court in 1890, and a territorial judge removed from the bench. It was a story about a woman who ran her father's business, and a man who kept meticulous records of a pattern he had been fighting alone. Mostly it was a story about what happened when 2 people who had both been waiting, separately and without knowing they were waiting, arrived at the same church door on the same August morning in 1884, and one of them opened the door before the other could knock because he had been listening for her footsteps, and when they stopped he had already decided in the quiet of that old wooden church to step toward whatever was standing on the other side. He had opened the door. She had stepped through. They had built everything from there, from that single-held moment of a woman unsure, and a man who had waited, from the particular courage of 2 people deciding to trust what was real. That was how it had begun. And from it had come Owen on the porch reading in the evening light, and Thomas asleep on his father's lap, and roses on the south side of the house, and soon on the north, and a sky full of stars that was remarkable every night if you were willing to stand under it and look up. And every year on a Thursday morning in August, Maggie Merritt walked to the Redemption Creek Community Church in the morning heat, and every year Simon was already there, having arrived early, and every year when her footsteps stopped at the door he opened it from the inside, because some things, once they become true, stay true, and some habits of waiting transform into habits of welcome, and the door between them had been open ever since.